There were times where the guards would actually crack his cell, and groups of men, prisoners, would go into the man's cell and beat him relentlessly. He was convicted of molesting his own children. There's no sympathy had here, that's for sure. And he was found strung up in a cell at home. That was the prerogative of every individual that tortured this man. Greetings and salutations, I'm Victor Sordi, and welcome to my channel at 28 to Persevere. Thanks for watching. On previous videos, I've talked in detail about the violence in the prison that I experienced personally and that I bore witness to throughout my 28 years of incarceration. What I've also briefly touched upon was my personal experiences dealing with sexual predators and what happened to them while I'm incarcerated. Those who violate small children and women, any type of sexual deviant that is defined by their crime, their hand is dealt in a fashion that warrants what happens to them behind the wall. They get their just desserts in more ways than one, and I've touched on that topic before on previous videos. Now, personally, I find it to be abhorrent and disgusting in every sense of the word, any type of sexual predator. And I saw a video previously on YouTube that I thought was pretty pertinent to the topic, and I'm going to share it here today, and curious to hear any comments about it. It shows the extent of what happens to men that are accused and convicted and sent to prison. And from what I saw personally throughout my 28 years of incarceration, those that are exposed as predators, because of the hierarchy in prison, they're looked down upon, and they're the bottom dwellers and bottom feeders in every sense of the word, and they suffer immensely as a result of it. There's many stabbings and killings that I bore witness to throughout my 28 years of men that were predators, and they got their just desserts. Now, personally, I remember one time in particular a guy who was literally tortured to death. It wasn't at one time, it was a systemic incident where throughout months and months of being verbally harassed, beaten, anytime he went out to the yard, there were times where the guards would actually crack his cell, and groups of men, prisoners, would go into the man's cell and beat him relentlessly. He was never cut or stabbed or anything of that nature. He was just beaten and slapped around, and anytime he went to commissary, he was robbed. Everything in his cell was taken from him. There was no sneak thieves, which were individuals that would get into your cell, or they would fish something out through a broom or whatever when you weren't there. So these were men that, when the gates were cracked, would run in there with razors and threaten his life and just slap him around, beat the shit out of the guy, and just rob him and beat him repeatedly. He was violated in every sense of the word. He went to the shower house. He was kicked around, and there was various forms of torture that were given to this man, even sexual torture that he went through that I remember hearing about. I thankfully never bore witness to. But this man eventually ended up taking his own life, and that was the plan all along. I mean, he was found strung up in a cell at home, and I know that was the prerogative of every individual that tortured this man. But his crimes were the worst form of crime that you can ever convict. He was convicted of molesting his own children, 3 children in particular, and one of his youngest children actually testified. He did this for 5 to 10, almost 10 years, on the ages between 3 and 13. There are 2 boys and a girl. So there's no sympathy had here, that's for sure, and it is what it is. And I remember this individual because he locked about 4 or 5 cells from me on the same company that I was in. I never spoke to the man, and I knew what he was there for. And I remember hearing the cells cracking, hearing him screaming and wallowing in pain, being tortured in his cells, and this went on for hours on end. And you know, you actually elaborate on this topic now, and most people would probably be like, obviously it's shocking, the reality of what this man went through. But when you look at the context of his crime, how can you ever have sympathy for someone like that? And he was eventually, as I said, he took his own life. And when I looked at this video previously on YouTube, it made me really, put in the context again of what I saw personally. So take a look at this video. Let me know what you think, and then we'll get back at it.
The officer stares, transfixed by the horrific scene before him. His hand slowly moves to cover his mouth as a wave of nausea hits. He gags once, then twice, barely holding it together. In the dimly lit cell, a naked prisoner lies motionless on the floor. Around him, a gruesome mix of blood, shattered skull fragments, and, horrifyingly, a spoon, lodged in a place no spoon should ever be. In a way, the officer is not surprised. The broken lump of flesh and bones on the floor was once a child predator, a special kind of inmate who regularly suffers the worst fate imaginable in prison. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. It is a real, true story, and perhaps one of the most grisliest incidents ever recorded within prison walls. But before we dive further into this nightmare scenario, let's pull back the curtain on life inside for the predators. No two prisons are alike, and experiences can differ. In the US and in most Western nations, there is an unwritten rule. If you're locked up for preying on children, you are not just unpopular, you are marked. Chomos, chesters, kitty fiddlers, tree jumpers, short eyes, rippers, skinners, rock spiders, and nonces. Whatever name you want to give to a predator, at the very least they will be treated like social pariahs. At worst, well, you'll see what happens soon when prisoners adopt a zero-tolerance policy toward these types of inmates. Let's look at some statistics first. In the United States alone, the sheer scale of incarceration is staggering. Across state prisons, local jails, and federal facilities, nearly 1.9 million people are behind bars in 2024. That's 583 per 100,000, a far higher rate than any other highly developed nation. In case you didn't know, there's a lot of violence in the USA. If we only look at state prisons with just over 1 million inmates, 674,000 of them are in for violent offenses. 168,000 of those people are in for sex offenses. The report doesn't state just how many of them are imprisoned for sex offenses specifically related to young people, but a Johns Hopkins University study in 2021 said there were around 127,000 inmates in the U.S. serving time in state prisons for sex offenses involving children. What this tells us is that U.S. prisons are crawling with sexual predators. The question is, how do this many men hide and avoid a beating? As a former prisoner wrote online, sex offenders, if they're stupid enough to go into a mainline yard, will get got. It almost always is never right away. They might lead the offender to a false sense of security. When you're inducted into a U.S. prison, you have an interview and you'll be asked if there's a reason you can't get placed in the general population. Being a chomo is a hell of a good reason if you don't want to get got, and that's when you can ask to be put in what's called protective custody, or PC. PC is not just a world of like-minded chomos. There's still a lot of dangerous prisoners in there. It's a special part of the prison where you'll also find plenty of snitches and guys who've left street gangs. Now let's take a look at the case of John Gagan, a former Roman Catholic priest who left over 150 boys suffering from decades of trauma. He ended up in Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center in Massachusetts. Even though he was in PC, a fellow prisoner named Joseph Lee Druce stomped his face in and strangled him to death. Just like a guy we'll talk about later, Druce was a killer who went to prison and said he would make it his life's work to hunt predators. These were the men who reminded him of the people who abused him when he was a child. Druce later said he was driven to murder when he heard Gagan share stories of his predatory past. Still, a murder in PC is unlikely, since if a prisoner is on parole, they might not want to ruin their chances of getting out. It's more likely a lifer would commit the attack, but there'd be a suspicion if a lifer asked to move to PC. Being attacked is not the only reason why PC isn't a very nice place to be for a convicted chester. You'll likely be spending 22 to 23 hours a day in your cell. You'll get the same commissary rights, but that's about it. Everything else is restricted. If you go out to the yard, it might just be you alone or in a small group, what they call a bull.
Oh.
Bullpen. When you shower, it'll be you alone, taken there in chains like an animal. You'll also likely not be able to work, and you can forget about group educational classes. Okay, so what if someone is a predator but they don't like the idea of all the restrictions in PC? Can they just lie about their crime and fit right into the general population? The answer is no, not likely. When you're the new guy in prison, quite often someone will come into your cell and demand to see your papers. If anywhere on those papers someone sees letters Joe and Mo, you're not going to have a fun time in that prison. It's almost impossible to hide your conviction in prison, and you won't get through your sentence without anyone ever asking about it. Prisoners have a lot of time on their hands, and they'll want to know what kind of man they're dealing with. If you don't have papers, it's quite easy to find out what you've done, since sentencing information is usually available online. Also, prison officers might just let it slip, since people who hurt women and kids aren't exactly high on the popularity list. And let's be honest, some officers just like R-rated drama. You will almost certainly not be able to say, "Oops, I forgot my papers," or "the dog ate them," or "you lost them." Most likely you'll be assigned a public defender, and with their overloaded caseload, you'll be left handling much of your legal work alone. You'll need to keep those papers close, because if anyone demands to see your charges and you refuse, it's like painting a target on your back, practically shouting, "I'm a Chester, please stab me." It all depends on which prison you're in, but any former prisoner will tell you that predators do not always get the crap beat out of them or killed. A prisoner might make it through their sentence, but only if they keep their past buried. No bragging, no slip-ups. It's also quite common to extort them, making them pay their way out of beatings like a chomo tax. Nonetheless, a former British prisoner who did 7 years in an Arizona prison said the gangs adhered to a KOS system, kill on sight, for chomos. Another term meaning the offender is fair game for a serious beating and is greenlit. That same guy says guards will often ignore horrific beatings, or at least when they weren't doing the beating themselves. In 2006, Orange County jail officers sat watching cops on TV as a group of inmates beat a software engineer named John Derek Chamberlain to death. The inmates said Chamberlain was a chomo, which wasn't exactly true. Sure, he was guilty of having sketchy content on his computer, but when you're handing out a death sentence, you should probably double-check the finer details. He was murdered over what the courts ruled a misdemeanor. He decided not to divulge his crime, so a shot caller greenlit a beating. 7 men unleashed a savage assault, stomping him relentlessly and violating him with a pencil and a tube of toothpaste. Now they're doing sentences ranging from 15 years to life. They killed a guy for a lie and in the process ruined their own lives. That's prison logic for you. Here's another fine example. In 2020, at the Larry D. Smith Correctional Facility in Banning, California, a man was beaten to death in his cell. The guy who did it had earlier asked his mother to look online to see what the guy had done. The answer? 100% Chester. "Don't get involved in it," she said. "No choice," he replied. This guy was serving time for assault with a deadly weapon on a police officer, a serious crime, but he would have gotten out with plenty of life left to live. Now he will spend the rest of his life in prison, without a chance of parole. Some people will literally lose everything to get at predators. You'll see one of the reasons for this in a minute or two. A way to avoid a deadly confrontation is to get yourself put in administrative segregation, ADSEG, although this does come with a number of downsides, so a lot of predators won't do it. ADSEG drives you up the wall due to the sheer loneliness. As a former long-term ADSEG prisoner once said, "Try locking yourself in a small bathroom and stay in there for half the day. Now imagine how that would feel for 10 years. The intrepid infographic show writer who wrote this video tried it for a whole hour. Let's just say patience and bravery aren't exactly his strong suit. You're in a tiny cell with no radio and no TV. It's you and 4 bare walls. No windows, no bars on the door to look through, just you and your mind. Maybe a book to read if you're lucky. They don't even allow you to keep your mattress to lie on during the day. You might only get 3 to 4 hours out of your cell in a whole week. When you do get yard time, it's either the bullpen or a fenced-in space underneath a roof. So you might never see the sky or feel a warm breeze blow across your face. Food is delivered to you through a slot in the door. If you go to shower, you turn around and put your hands through the slot to be handcuffed. When you sleep, it's often to the sound of screams. It is quite simply torture. But if you're a targeted chomo and you can't immediately get placed in PC, this might be your only option. Let's say you ignore the warnings and stay in the general population to tough it out. What's the absolute worst that can happen? In the UK, chomo intolerance is just as strict as it is in the US. Yet the most brutal stories we found come from England, the land of good manners, beans on toast, and apparently some shockingly vicious attacks on nonsense. In 2012, a 33-year-old male prisoner in Durham prison was described by a psychiatrist as a remorseless, callous psychopath who harbors cannibalistic urges. He and another prisoner, 24, lured a 23-year-old guy into a cell. This young man had been sentenced in 2011 for predatory actions involving a 13-year-old girl. Once he was in the cell, the two men proceeded to hold him down and, amongst other things, slice him up with a razor blade. They took a pen and pushed it into one of his eyeballs. Once he was dead, they disemboweled him. When asked later why they chose this particular man when they had scores of other predators to choose from, one of them said they just fancied doing it. As is often the case with extreme prison violence, the perpetrators are not usually heroes intent to clean up society, but maniacs who just want an excuse to keep hurting people. The older guy in this attack was serving 24 years for sneaking through a window in a nursing home for vulnerable women. He attacked two of the women, one in her 50s and one in her 70s, who were sharing a room. He suffocated one and brutally assaulted the other. This was certainly no hero with a profound sense of ethics. Many of the men who hurt predators in prison are doing it because someone hurt them when they were young. Statistics show us that the rates of childhood abuse, both physical and sexual, are higher among prisoners than on the outside. This brings us to Robert Maudsley, a man often called Britain's scariest prisoner. In 1974, he murdered a man who'd shown him photos of children he'd hurt, and he was sent to the infamous psychiatric hospital Broadmoor. In 1977, he tortured a fellow patient for 9 hours, intermittently sticking the man's bloodied head to the window to show the staff what he was doing. This victim, like Motley's first victim, had hurt children. When the staff finally opened the door, an officer said the victim's head had been, quote, cracked open like a boiled egg. A spoon had been pushed through the man's ear and deep into his head. The rumor soon spread that Maudsley had eaten the man's brain, which wasn't true, but the tabloids went ahead and nicknamed him the Cannibal and the Brain Eater. Too dangerous for the hospital, Maudsley was sent to Wakefield Prison, aka Monster Mansion, a place infamous for sexual predators. Suffice it to say, given his reputation as a cannibal, he didn't get so much grief from the other prisoners. In 1978, he took his French teacher, a convicted predator, to his cell, where he strangled him and stabbed him to death. Maudsley hid the body under his bed. He then called out to the landing and asked if anyone wanted to join him in his cell. Unsurprisingly, no one took him up on the offer, so he went hunting. He planned to murder 7 men, all predators. You probably already guessed Maudsley himself was an abused child. This was revenge. He walked into a guy's cell, locked the door, and proceeded to hack at him with a knife. Unable to convince anyone to come have a chat with him, he calmly walked down the hallway as prisoners parted like the Red Sea. He then went to the staff office and informed the guards that they should expect 2 fewer men at roll call that night. Too dangerous even for prison, he was later moved to the basement, where he's still rotting away to this day in a specially made transparent Perspex cage. The authorities have refused his request for a bird as a companion. The rules state not even the officers can speak to him. He once wrote in a letter, "I am left to stagnate, vegetate, and to regress, left to confront my solitary head-on with people who have eyes but don't see, and who have ears but don't hear, who have mouths but don't speak." He's requested cyanide, but the British authorities are too kind to let him die. He's described as gentle and kind with a genius-level IQ. He loves classical music, poetry, and art. So now you know where the idea of Hannibal Lecter comes from. He blames his parents for the murders he committed, once saying, "When I kill, I think I have my parents in mind. If I had killed my parents in 1970, none of these people need have died." So, if a predator ever finds himself in prison, he should know there are Robert Maudsleys around who can't wait to meet them. Prison has its own brutal justice, but does it go too far?
My thoughts on the video is that it's pretty elaborate and it's pretty extensive and gives you a pretty good overview of not only the individuals who were killed as a result of their crimes, but the individuals that did the killing. A little background on them too. So, give you a little insight. I mean, the motives behind it. Everybody has an MO, and when you look at the context of any type of crime, you really have to understand the motives of the individuals and what led to that experience and why they did what they did. But men in prison in particular, there is a hierarchy, there is a way of life, there is principles and noble virtues that men abide by. It's probably hard for most people to wrap their mind around that, thinking everyone inside is a savage and deserves their fate. But the reality is it's far different than that. There are men inside that just want to mind their business. They're not engaged in this type of conduct, or the individuals around them. They could care less about them. And those men, deal with the prison system as they deal with it and the individuals around them in the context of survival. But I bore witness to many of this. There were gangs I knew, and personally, I was very close to and friendly with. There was mutual respect between them and I. And I remember this one gang in particular that was their entire prerogative was to hunt not only rats but child molesters, and they would distinctively engage in a behavior that would mark each individual that they knew to be a child molester. They would mark them. They would come up to them and they would cut them, and so that their face was disfigured, and everyone knew that that individual was cut in such fashion that distinguished him from the other prisoners as a child molester. If he was still kept in general population after the cutting, most of the time they weren't. They were shipped off or put in protective custody. But once they landed in another spot, if they weren't directly put into protective custody and they were in the general population, they were distinctly recognized by the cut. And a lot of times it was a cut that would go from the tip of their mouth, usually here, and they would end up go across all the way out to their ear, and it was a long line. And that particular cut in particular would show that they were what they were, which was a child molester or a sexual predator of some kind. And so it's very interesting because you see this, and all the prisons universally recognize what a child molester is and a rapist is, and rapos are, as I said previously, the bottom feeders. And in the predatory system of governance that is behind the wall and how people move and what they give power to, a predator is prey when it all comes down to it. They are distinctly prey, and that they are 100% fodder for the general population, rightfully so to a large extent. So it's a form of justice inside that this video briefly touched upon, and it happens. And the fate of the men that do the crimes that are committed against these men, they suffer accordingly. Some could care less. Whether or not you feel that they're honorable in their actions and justice is served is your prerogative to harbor. Personally, as I said previously, I have no sympathy for any type of rapist. I have the utmost respect for women and children in particular. I'm a father, so speaking from a father's perspective, I would do anything for my children and protect my family at all costs. Whatever the fate's prerogative was after that, my initial reaction would be to protect my own. So it's hard for me to ever find any type of sympathy for any type of sexual deviant. That's for shit and sure. But I'm really curious to hear everybody's take on this, and hit me up with a comment. Yay or nay, if they agree with what happens to men inside that are sexual predators, they deserve their fate. I'm real curious to hear what they got to say. Until next time, go with the gods and persevere.